I met Dr. von Braun in person by chance. I was downtown at the old Russell Erskine Hotel. This was back in 1962, in the late winter or early spring of '62. I was teaching school. I'd come to Huntsville to teach math and science at Madison Academy, and I was just down to get a haircut. And this was before Research Park existed and all the growth that's taken place. It was a small town then, and as typical of southern towns, there's always a barber shop in the hotel that was always close to the courthouse square. And I was just in getting a haircut on a Saturday morning, and he walked in with had his briefcase, and the barber shop was just about full. There was a lot to talk about with price of cotton and Alabama football prospects and all that. So there weren't many empty seats, and he came in and happened to sit down next to me. And of course, I was in awe of him, but he did not know me from anybody. So it's my ordinary practice. When I see somebody I think of as a celebrity, I don't bother them. I give them their privacy. And after a while, he finished what he was doing and put the papers back in his briefcase, and he turned and smiled, and he had one of those smiles that just light up a room, and spoke to me and said, "Well, what are you doing?" And I told him that I was teaching school, and he said something to the effect, "Well, that's wonderful. We need school teachers. What do you teach?" And I said, "Math and science." And he said, "Oh, what is your background? What is your degree?" And I could remember I just graduated the preceding spring. And I said, "Well, I had a double major in math and physics." And he said, "Oh, that's what I majored in, so math and physics. What classes did you take?" And I mean, he went through every class I could remember. And he wanted to know what it covered, and he wanted to know what grade I'd made. And at the end, he asked if I had ever had any interest in working in the space program. Of course, the space program had just begun shortly before that. And I told him that I was fascinated with it, but I had not thought about working at it. Frankly, I didn't feel qualified because I didn't go to MIT or Caltech or any of the big-name engineering schools. I went to the University of Central Missouri, which really had its origins as a teacher's college. So I didn't feel qualified. But he said, "Well, if you ever change your mind, talk to personnel and tell them that you and I talked on this date." And I said I thought there was a place for you at Marshall. And so that's what I did, and they set me up with a series of interviews and a map how to get to each one of the offices. The first one I went to was I talked to a gentleman named Helmut Bauer, who was a second-generation German, and he explained to me what they were doing, what he was working on, and it was absolutely fascinating to me. And at the end of that, he pointed to the dynamic test facility. He explained that they had lost a large number of the A4 rockets, which became the V2 when it was deployed, A4 when it was being developed, because they didn't understand the relation between controlling the vehicle and the bending of the vehicle, which is, they look rigid, but they're not actually rigid. They're flexible enough that when a sensor picks up a little bit of bending, it interprets that as an error and tries to correct it. And if they don't understand how that all works together, the bending and excites the propellant slosh, and the propellant slosh excites the bending, and it can go you start with the vehicle oscillating. Pretty soon it is a major oscillation. It either goes out of control or breaks apart. And they lost a large number of those vehicles till they understood that. And there were a lot of people that thought the biggest technical issue to building the Saturn V, this little A4 only had about 50,000 pounds of propellant. The Saturn V weighed 6 million pounds, and 5 million pounds of that was propellant. It was 363 feet long, so the bending was very significant in a relative sense. And the large tanks with that amount of propellant sloshing, and it was being controlled by moving 4 of the 5 F1 engines, and each one of those engines weighed 18,400 pounds. So there was a lot of dynamics going on. A lot of people felt that they would have a very difficult time if they could ever get it controlled. And that was his job, and that's why they built that dynamic test tower, was so that he would have the data on how the vehicle bent, what is first mode, second mode, third mode. And they went up through, I think, 6 modes of the vehicle at subsequently higher frequencies. And then he had propellant testing done all over the country, and they were getting that. So he had to build a mathematical model that represented the bending and the sloshing of the vehicle that could be used then to do the dynamics analysis to get the stability, wind response, loads, and that kind of thing. We gave that then to the Astronautics laboratory, and the Astronautics laboratory then built the actual flight computer to try to match the gain and phase requirements that we had given them. And he asked me if I'd like to work in that, and I said, I can't imagine anything more interesting than this. So I went to work here on July the 2nd of 1962. What he would do is he would require weekly notes from all of his direct reports every Friday afternoon. He would take those home, and over the weekend, he would go through every single one of them, and he would make annotations, what he wanted done about whatever was being reported. And he didn't want to just report that from people saying, well, we had this meeting, and like most of the weekly notes that you see in recent years. He wanted detailed information on a gyroscope that didn't work or a test that didn't, and how they were working. He would make his notes, and on Monday morning, he would bring those in and would dump those on Bonnie's desk, and she would get the annotated note to each one of the senders of what his instructions were, how to address the problem. So, well, they wanted all the information that they could possibly get. They talked, you didn't necessarily have to go through chain of command. They wanted to talk to everybody that had any information. Von Braun personally, he was known to show up. They were doing a lot of work, they were literally working 24/7 on various things, and he would sometimes show up in the middle of the night and talk to the people that were working on a piece of hardware and ask them what they were doing, how it was going, what the problems were, going completely around the chain of command. All of them were very interested in getting the job done. They fought and they argued and they disagreed violently, but in the end they would make a decision, and once the decision was made, there was no further discussion of it. Once it was decided, then even the people who didn't like it were inclined to do exactly what everybody had agreed to. And there was no, what I told you shouldn't have done, none of that. It was always a decision that he would listen. All of the managers were that way, and Von Braun in particular. They would listen as long as you had data. When they wanted to hear all the data. Once the data ended and you started an opinion, they were no longer interested. They were interested in the information. And once a decision was made, then it became the decision, and there was no second guessing. They were a good group to work with. I found them to be delightful. One of the big issues, of course, was loading. What kind of loads a vehicle is going to see, and how you represented those loads in the analysis. Bill Vaughn, who you just talked with, was responsible for the environment through which the vehicle was going to fly, and they developed something that they called a synthetic profile for design purposes. They came up with, we didn't have the capability in those days to fly the vehicle through a large database of winds. The computational capability at that time was relatively slow, and we just didn't have that they do that today. But what he would do was analyze all those winds and determine percentiles of what the likelihood was, and then they would superimpose a gust on it. So they would start out with what was the 95 percentile of the highest wind, and then they would use a build-up to that that's called the wind shear, and they'd take 99% of the wind shear, and then they would superimpose on that a square wave gust right at the worst possible time, and that's what we designed to. And we ran with the analysis that we did that was done in my area in the Aeroballistics Laboratory. We took the data from the dynamic test tower. We then built mode shapes from that, what the bending looked like, determined the frequencies and the generalized mass, did the same thing with the slosh, and built all that into a series of equations that we could then expand into what was called the characteristic equation, and we would solve that characteristic equation and find where the roots were. It was a new technique. It's common today, but it was new then. Most of the techniques we were doing, we were having to develop as we went. But it's called root locus, and we would determine where the various roots were, and that would determine whether you're in a range of stability, and you could vary the gains and vary the phase, and with that you were able to determine how much margin you had of each, and that's how we solved that problem. We also then calculated the loads when we had the bending, all that in there. We developed the equations that would allow us to analyze what the bending moment on the vehicle would be at every station on it, and make sure that the structure was capable of standing the bending moment. So it's a pretty complex thing, and it took a lot of interaction between the laboratory I was in, aeroballistics, and the avionics lab. We worked together to get that analysis out, and we never had a vehicle structurally fail. Well, the vehicle itself, of course, was very, very large, and at the time that facility was built, it was the tallest self-supporting structure in the state of Alabama. I think there maybe be one or two bank buildings in Birmingham that may be taller than that today, but at that time it was about 400 feet high. The vehicle was 363 feet, and it towered a little above that. We could put the entire stack in there, and they attached shakers to it, and so they could literally vary the frequency and measure what the vehicle was doing, how it was responding. And that's how they would find where the natural frequencies of the vehicle were. And so what they were doing was putting an actual vehicle in and actually dynamically measuring what the vehicle did when it was shaken. And they even put in propellant in the tanks and got the combined effects of propellant slosh along with the vehicle's structural bending. And that then fed into the equations that we then did the analysis on. SA 501 was the designation we used for the first one, and that happened in late 1967. And it was a almost flawless test. It was amazing how perfectly everything performed on that. The following April, in April of 1968, we had a different test, AS 502, and that was not the same. We had many, many problems with it that we had not anticipated, and how we fixed it and what we did with it, to me, was one of the most interesting experiences that I had in NASA. During the first stage, they got something that is called pogo effect. And it's like a pogo stick, it's oscillating. The thrust builds up, then it drops off, and it shakes the vehicle much like a pogo stick does. And that they had anticipated that they might have a pogo issue, and they had made provisions to put in accumulators if they were necessary, but it had not shown up on the first one, so they felt pretty good about it. But they got it in a big way on the second one. Then in the second stage flight, that was in S1C flight, during S2 flight, they got a signal that one of the parameters that they monitored on one of the 5 engines had crossed a red line. I can't remember now if it was temperature or pressure, but one of the red lines that it shouldn't cross. So they wanted to make sure that the engine did not fail catastrophically and blow up the vehicle. So they made the decision to shut down that engine. And when they did that, they sent a command and it shut the engine down. But as we had a backup for nearly everything at that time, and they sent a second command to make sure that the engine was shut down. Unfortunately, there was a miswiring problem, and they shut down the opposite engine. So instead of having one engine out, we had 2 engines out. But it still kept going, and it was enough that they could still make it to orbit. The third stage, because of a propellant line had shaken loose, probably related to that pogo problem, but because of that, they were unable to do a restart. Ordinarily, the Saturn V, it had the 5J2 S engines in the second stage and a single J2S engine in the third stage, a liquid hydrogen engine, and they were identical engines except the one in the third stage had a restart capability, and they would burn the S1C stage, it would fall into the ocean. Then they would burn the S2 stage, and it would fall into the ocean off the coast of Africa, go much further. And then they would light the S4B third stage for its first burn, and it would burn into orbit. And the intent was that you would stay in orbit until you had checked out all the systems and had the proper alignment to go to the moon. Then they would restart the J2 engine on the third stage, and it would do the translunar injection burns, TLI, that would send the spacecraft on its way to the moon, at which time the Saturn had done its job. It got them on the way. And because of all that vibration, a line had come loose, and as a result of that, they were not able to do a restart. So they made it to orbit, but they couldn't restart it. They also had a failure of one of the SLA panels, the service limb adapter panels, which is that kind of truncated area you see above when it transitions from the diameter of the S4B down to the diameter of the service module on the spacecraft. That was a frustum of a cone, and that's where they kept the lunar lander was in there, and on the actual missions. And one of those panels actually structurally failed. When they had a meeting following that, it happened here at Marshall, von Braun, the associate administrator for space flight, the head of the Apollo program and headquarters, and all the senior managers here and from Houston were all here to discuss where do we go from here. And that was a very, very big thing. They got the vehicle to orbit, but it had nearly failed at every point along the way. And so this group analyzed that, and they felt they understood it. The reason that they had the failure in the first stage, that pogo effect, was they did not have the accumulators in that they thought they would need, so they could put them in and take care of that problem. The second stage, there wasn't anything wrong with the engine. They simply had a sensor was bad and sent indication that they needed to shut it down, and the wiring was just a miswired problem. So there wasn't anything other than make sure that you always know that sensors can fail, and just be sure that they're thoroughly checked and make sure that the wiring is right, and that took care of that. In the third stage, they found out the reason that they had never encountered any kind of a problem with the vibration in the feed line was that when they tested it, it was on the ground and there was moisture. And as soon as they ran the hydrogen fuel into the line, immediately it was coated with ice. Well, in space, there was no moisture, therefore there was no ice. And so the line needed to be stabilized, and so all they had to do was add some stability brackets to it, and they understood that. There was actually a design flaw in the SLA panels, and that was easy to redesign. So they felt that they understood everything about what had gone wrong, and there was another Apollo flight planned later that summer. It wouldn't be a Saturn V, it would be a Saturn 1B, but that would give them the chance to test the S4B, because it was the second stage of the Saturn 1B and it was the third stage of Saturn V. So they could check it then, and they would be able to check those SLA panels and make sure that was right. And if they didn't find anything there, and in subsequent tests didn't find anything, they decided that they could fly the next one as a manned flight. And that was important because it was costing a lot of money. Even in those days, it was there were disputes about how do you count the money, just like on the shuttle. No one could ever agree exactly what a shuttle cost. But it was $100 to $300 million, and that was in 1960s type dollars. And so that would be, probably over $1 billion today's cost. And so they didn't want to make any additional flights if they didn't have to. And they made the decision that they understood all the problems, and the problems had all been, if they were all, with further testing, it confirmed what they had decided, that there was no reason that they couldn't fly the next one manned. and that became the third Saturn V flight, and we know it as Apollo 8. I'd say Apollo 8 in many ways was my favorite of all of the missions. 1968 was a very traumatic year in this country. It's hard to overstate how traumatic it was. In April, Martin Luther King, Dr. King, was assassinated in Memphis, and there were riots in the streets following that. It was a very difficult time. It was a very difficult. President Johnson decided not to seek another term, and there was a lot of competition for who was going to be the Democratic candidate. Robert F. Kennedy looked like he was surging into the lead, and in June, he was assassinated in Los Angeles at a hotel after he had had a very successful day, and it looked like he was going to be the candidate. He was shot there and died early the next morning. And so we'd had those two terrible things happen. And then in July, the Democrats had their convention that year in Chicago, and there was massive protest. And Mayor Daley, he basically, I would characterize his response as being almost brutal. He had police on horses with nightsticks, and they were literally beating people, severely beating them. And that was going on outside the convention when they were doing the nominating process. So that was a very ugly scene. And all of these things had made this a very dramatic and traumatic year. In about September, NASA management, and that was well above my pay grade, senior management learned that the Russians were planning to do a circumnavigation flight around, circumlunar flight, and go around the moon. Well, they had beat us into space with their Sputnik. And then they later, the next one, they carried up a little dog, Leica, who only lived a few hours. And then Yuri Gagarin had become the first first human to go into orbit. And he had done that ahead of us. He had done that, I believe, in April of 1961. And so it was, they had beat us to the punch every time. And I think there was a pretty strong feeling that they were not going to beat us to the moon. That's the whole reason the lunar program was started, was to show that we could start out from behind and capitalism was superior to communism and that we could catch up and go ahead. And we were not about to let them do that. So the courageous decision was made to launch Apollo 8 that would be a manned flight, a circumlunar flight. And that made it very, very dramatic. And you just couldn't make this stuff up. They arrived in lunar orbit December the 24th of 1968, which was to arrive on Christmas Eve. And that night, they literally took turns and they read the first 10 verses of the book of Genesis in the beginning, and explained the biblical account of how creation took place. And they took turns reading that. No one protested except there was one well-known atheist of that day, Madeline Murray O'Hare, and she protested. But in general, there was no outcry. That flight was just exactly the lift that the country needed at that time. After it ended the year on such a positive note when it had been such a negative year up until then. And of course, it was an important thing for not only to demonstrate that it would work, that we could do that. They couldn't land, but they went into orbit and they maneuvered. And they saw two sights that no human eyes had ever seen before. They saw the backside of the moon, and that had never been seen before. We'd seen pictures of it from satellites, but no one had actually seen it because the moon, as you know, is gravity gradient stabilized, which means it keeps the same orientation toward the Earth all the time, whether it's regardless of the phase it's in, whether it's bright or whether it's dark, the same face always is toward the Earth. And no one had ever seen the backside of it except pictures of it. Well, they actually saw the backside of the moon. And maybe even more dramatic than that, when they came around, they saw something that no human eye had ever seen, or I guess no one had even given much thought to it, but they saw Earthrise. and they were all taking pictures of it. But the picture I think that Jim Lovell took was the one that actually they teased each other in appearances about who it was that actually took the picture that everyone has seen. It was actually Jim Lovell, but each of them claims that they did it. It's all in good-natured fun. They all understand and accept that Lovell's picture did it. That's the most popular picture in NASA's history, and one of the most popular ever. It's absolutely beautiful. And I think that Frank Borman and Lovell and Andrews on that flight, they saw the Earth in a different way than anyone ever had before, and I think they were quite moved by how fragile everything looked. I think a lot of people believe that was sort of the start of the environmental movement. He saw how fragile it was. He talked about the good Earth, and it was very moving. Now, for me personally, that was an especially neat thing. I married in August of that year, of August of 1968, and so I was 30 and my young bride was 20, and we went to her home in Kansas City and sat in with all the family together watching on television when Apollo 8, when all that took place. So it had a particular impact to me. It was a small city when I came here. I think at that point it was up to about 30,000 people or so. It had been like 10,000. When Redstone Arsenal was reactivated, Redstone Arsenal and Huntsville Arsenal both existed during World War II. Both were closed at the end of the war. There was a big push to get something to replace them in our economy. The Germans had deployed a jet fighter at the end of the war. It came in too late to really do anything. It could only stay up for a little while and wasn't especially maneuverable. But it showed that the next aircraft propulsion was going to be the jet propulsion, and the nation needed a large tunnel so that they could test full-size jet fighters in it. And there was a lot of competition. Alabama was competing for it, and Tennessee was competing for it. And in those days, it was a solid Democratic South. This was before the Civil Rights Movement in 1950, and this was solid Democratic territory. And in those days, all of the senators stayed as long as they wanted to stay. They basically, it was considered almost unpatriotic to run against them in a primary, and the other party didn't bother to run against them in the fall because it wasn't worth the effort. They couldn't win. And so we had Senator Sparkman that had been in for a long time, very powerful. Georgia had Senator Griffin, and he stayed in for a very, very long time. Tennessee had Estes Kefauver and Al Gore Sr. They had powerful senators. Mississippi had Senator Stennis. Louisiana had Senator Long, and all these people would stay 20, 30 years, and they had control of all the money. They controlled every committee. They controlled everything. And so they kind of worked it out among themselves. Well, Tennessee and Alabama were competing to get that wind tunnel, and in the end, Tennessee got it. So somewhat as a consolation prize, they had already kind of wanted to get all the missile work together. They brought this group that had come over under Operation Paperclip. They were out in White Sands, and then we had other missile work going in other places. They looked at the facility here, and Redstone Arsenal had almost 60 square miles. It had the river for good transportation. It had rail. It was a good climate. There were a lot of things going for it, and in the end, we got that as a consolation prize. Tullahoma was about 10,000 to 15,000 people when they got the wind tunnel. It's 10 to 15,000 people today. Huntsville, when we got that, was about 10,000 people. Today, it's approaching 200,000 people, and in the next census will probably be the second largest, and when the census after that probably be the largest city in Alabama. So it ended up the consolation prize was a pretty good one after all. My work on Apollo on Saturn V had been with respect to the design, the dynamic stability, the wind loads, that kind of thing. I had no operational role in it at all. And Dr. von Braun was very, very good to make sure that people who had worked on the Saturn V that were not involved with its operation had the opportunity to see history made. So he made it possible for us all to go down and to see it. So I was able to, when I married in August of '68, my office that I was working with, they gave me the newest technology, Super 8 movie camera, projector, screen, and all that. And of course, Super 8 was an improvement over 8 millimeter or 16 millimeter, but it was not like videos today that are digital. It was still film. But I had that, and we took it down, and Penny and I went to that launch, and we were about as close as we were about 3.5 miles. We were just north of the VAB and had a perfect, clear, unrestricted view of the launch. And I took my own. I still have my own pictures I took of it, but the Saturn V looks about that high. I didn't have a telescopic lens, but I do have my own recording of the launch of it, and it was absolutely just beautiful. And the excitement of all the people that were there. I don't know how many people there. I think there were several 100,000 people who watched it in person, and it was really wall-to-wall people. And it was just exciting to be a part of it. And we made it back to Huntsville in time to be in our family room. And we had a new house that we had moved into, and we were able to see the sit in our den and watch those ghostly pictures from when they first stepped on the moon. And so it was just a very fantastic thing for me. So I was able to, in effect, it was like we had been married less than a year, so it was sort of a second honeymoon for us. And it was a wonderful time, and I have incredible memories of what that was like. And of course, the mission, the idea of people actually landing on the moon. There are skeptics today who question that we did it, but that's ridiculous. I mean, our satellites can even take pictures of where we touched down and see the landing stage, which the landing stage on the Apollo was used as the launch stage to go back up. And so that first stage is still on the moon, and you can still see right where it was. And it's just ridiculous, but there are skeptics that even today think we didn't go. But that was a fun time. First of all, I don't think anyone at that time, you could have never got a bet that we wouldn't have gone on to Mars in the next 50 years, that we would go to the moon, we would land 6 times, 12 people would walk on the moon, and it would all end in just a couple of years, and that we would never go back. In fact, we didn't. People had kind of lost interest in it. We were so successful it almost looked routine, and they decided we've been very lucky. We've had a lot of close calls, but we've been lucky. Why take a chance on having a disaster? So the flight hardware for Apollo 18 was built, but it didn't fly. We have the actual rover vehicle is out in the Space and Rocket Center here. That's not a test vehicle. That was going to be the hardware on Apollo 18, and the actual Saturn V launch vehicle is the one that is down at the Johnson Space Center that you can see. The one we have out here is the dynamic. It's what was in the dynamic test tower. Is what we have here, and the propulsion test articles are what they have at the Kennedy Space Center. But they all look the difference between that and the flight hardware. You can't tell the difference, but it's interesting to see that. And of course, then we have the high fidelity mock-up. It's not a real vehicle, but it looks so much like it, you couldn't tell that it's not vertical. So this is the only spot on Earth that you can go see what a Saturn V looked like vertical. But the fact that we did not go forward, I think, would be the biggest disappointment in the Apollo program. I think everyone expected that the next step would be Mars. And we had, at that time, we had a National Space Council chaired by the Vice President, as it is today. And at that time, it was Spiro Agnew, and Nixon was the president. And they were prepared to go forward. And when they asked how long it would take, they envisioned this being something that would happen during Nixon's second term. When they found out we could not go to Mars that quickly, then they lost interest in it. And so, that was kind of the end of that program. And we have not been back to the moon, and nobody else has ever been. I think that a lot of people without any bias say that our landing men on the moon was the greatest achievement of the 20th century. And of course, it's not hard to convince me of that. We knew at the time that we were making history. What we didn't know was what kind of history it was going to be. We weren't sure if it was going to be, as it turned out to be, a moment of great triumph, or if it was going to be the greatest fiasco of all time, kill people, spend billions of dollars, and still not get there. So we knew we were making history one way or the other. I'm glad it turned out the way it did.